This is Pastor David Donovan at I Jesus Streetlight Missionary Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. This video is about President George Bush Jr. acknowledging that what he did invading Iraq was unjustified and brutal. A quote, slip of the tongue when he was supposed to be saying Ukraine, calling for war crimes against President Putin and Russia. From the time that President Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, the left in America and other countries were calling for him to be arrested for war crimes. And so this is very, very interesting that this Freudian slip of the tongue comes out of his mouth after he says that the invasion of Iraq, quote, was unjustified and brutal and all of that. He says, oh, I meant Ukraine, but then he says, and Iraq. So coming out of his soul. The next thing that you're going to look at is this short video of President Bush doing this, and I will be back and read to you something out of my journal during this time when President Bush was invading Iraq.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Brutal invasion of Ukraine. In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia, and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
Let me read to you now dreams that I was having back during Bush's time in office, before and after. Our church here in Fort Worth, the Lord started giving me dreams and visions back in '94 in relation to where America is now, the destruction, the invasion, the judgment that's coming up on the nation, primarily for the straw that breaks the camel's back for America is all the presidents since Jimmy Carter have messed with trying to divide the land of Israel. And Zechariah 12:3 says that those who try to divide that land in the last days will be cut to pieces. And by the way, President Biden is scheduled to go into the east side of Jerusalem, the Palestinian side, in September and call for annexing land and dividing up Israel again. This will be the 8th president to do this since Jimmy Carter. Let me read this to you. 5/19/2022, I wrote this. Wow, wow, wow. Yesterday, while President Bush Jr. calling for the arrest of President Putin for war crimes, states before the whole world in this video, I am guilty of war crimes. The plan internationally in the United Nations behind the scenes has been since 2003 to arrest President Bush Jr. for war crimes for the Iraq War. Not like his father, George Bush Sr., who had most of the world backing him when he went into Kuwait to push the Iraq army back into Iraq. Bush did not. The coalition of nations willing to support the United States invasion of Iraq includes countries that have not traditionally been American allies, let alone military powerhouses. Many would argue that this mismatch of 30 general small nations did more to refute the legitimacy of the second American conflict with Iraq than it did to support the invasion. The international press has reportedly mocked the so-called coalition of the willing. The press claims that these countries did not join the coalition in order to help liberate the Iraq people, but because they were motivated by self-interest. The derision of the press is also due to the fact that aside from the United Kingdom and Australia, the coalition failed to provide any significant combat assistance to the United States. In fact, some of the countries that signed on with the U.S. are physically incapable of providing such help because they do not have armed forces. Popular support for the invasion was negligible outside the United States, even in the countries that announced their support, be it symbolic or otherwise. This includes Great Britain, where a majority of the public opposed the military action. This was why Bush and Blair were not prepared to allow the weapons inspectors who were in Iraq any more time. Inspectors had found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction in the lead up to the war and never did, but were ordered to go home. I am not alone in these views. There is substantial consensus of international legal opinion which recognizes the illegality of the invasion. Kofi Annan, then the UN Secretary General, told the BBC in 2004 that the charter had been breached and that the invasion was not sanctioned by the Security Council, like the one for his father before, Bush Sr. In my prayer journals, me talking now, I have kept since 1984, I dreamed in the spring of March 2003, President Bush was arrested for war crimes. Now this was the same month the war started. And again, September 2008, I dreamed the same dream. Then in January 2009, when Obama took office, I dreamed the deal had been cut behind closed doors to turn President Bush Jr. over for war crimes. Then in December 2011, the month the Iraq War was officially declared over, I dreamed President Bush is arrested, carried out of his home by force. He was dragged out of his home. I am talking to him about Jesus in the dream. You ask, why would God let this happen? And that is the only way it can happen. Number one, he broke international law like Hitler, and the rest of the world knows it. Number two, President Bush Jr., quote 2005, what happens in Gaza once Israel withdraws will fall to the United States. That's the hidden meaning in the President's letter of assurance to Sharon, saying the United States will lead an international effort to build the capacity and will of the Palestinian institutions to fight terrorism, prevent prevent the areas from which Israel withdraws from posing a threat. All this for the withdrawal of Jewish families, many carried out of their homes by force. Got it? From all 21 settlements in Gaza and 4 in the West Bank after 38 years of being back in the land. Check this out. Here is the Bible punishment for this deed in the last days. Psalms 149, 9 through 7. Psalms 149, 7 through 9. 7. To inflict vengeance on the nations and punishments on the people, to bind their kings with chains and their nobles with shackles of iron, to execute judgment written against them. This honor is for all his saints. Hallelujah. Okay. Our church split when I started prophesying these dreams in the 2000s about President Bush. Before that, the Lord had already given me American Airlines being used by Islam to attack America. Also before that, the Lord had given me the assassination of Rabin. And before the war started in 2003, the Lord gave me in February the fulfillment of the dream that I dreamed in '99 of the explosion of the Columbia Space Shuttle. Columbia, District of Columbia. The United States of America. At that time, all the Arabs said it was a sign. It was a sign. Those who hate Israel saw it as a sign, because they saw how they perceived the wickedness of America. But God said in Zechariah, in the last days, do not divide my land, and I will cut to pieces every nation that does that. America has been suffering judgment, the final straw, since Jimmy Carter did Camp David. After he did Camp David, we got the Iran hostage crisis. Not one president, including Ronald Reagan, backed off being a real estate broker for the nation of Israel. And that's where we are today. With as bad as things, in other words, you look at America, we're terribly divided. That's because we've been dividing the land of Israel. The author Coney, the book Face to Face, about how many things has happened to America every time one of these presidents has entered into trying to divide the land and be a real estate broker for Israel. We are now, with President Biden on his way in September to stand with the Palestinians and divide the land of Israel, we are at the door of invasion and final destruction and horror in the United States of America. Many people who went to our church, that in 1984 the Lord started here in Fort Worth, and they started hearing these things in 2000. The Lord was showing me was coming, and I had to tell it, because God always sends warning before judgment. Many people left the fellowship because it was utter madness to even believe that, because we were the great nation, we were doing the right things. Except most churches people went to in America at that time, and even now more, are anti-Semitic, not believing that Israel still has a covenant with God. Okay? So it was strange for me to be saying America's in trouble for doing this to Israel. Well, many of these people now, watching all this stuff, they'll remember these prophecies and say, wait a minute, I heard this in my church, what was coming. And these people are going to get right with God because that's the way prophecy is. Prophecy is a warning, the Spirit of God, to God's people, that He's in charge, He's in control. And He doesn't send warning to judge, He sends warning to deliver, to save. And some will take the warning and some will not. How much time do we have? I do not know. I will tell you that every other time one of our presidents has done this, destruction hit almost immediately. In the case of George Bush Sr., when he was at the Madrid conference trying to divide up the land of Israel, his home was blown off its foundation in Kennebunkport by a terrible storm. A week after George Bush Jr. Carried the settlers out of the West Bank into Gaza, Katrina killed as many people as were carried out in the stuff that was done in Israel. And every one of these, if you'll just take the time, I can't go over all of them, you'll see is boom, 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 because God always sends warning before judgment, because He's on. And there's patterns, just like a woman with the pregnancy. The signs and the tremors and the birth pains get closer and closer together. It's time, the baby is coming. So I can tell you where we are. The baby is coming. The baby is coming. Get your heart right, American church. Get your heart right. Those of you who have been in the church and other churches where you've heard this kind of stuff, but there were so many people against it and they were politically correct in the church. You didn't want to be part of being mocked and be called a troublemaker, so you walked with those who were rejecting the Spirit of God, what the prophets in America were saying, what the pastors were speaking, that God was showing them in prayer, dreams and visions and things. If you read the book of Zechariah, it talks about the cutting to pieces the nations that divide the land. And if you'll read the book of Jeremiah, you will see the personality of God that leads up perfectly to what's happening in America. Jesus is Lord.